Welcome to Explorations in Biblical Studies. Few biblical texts have generated more confusion, abuse, and theological distortion than the brief and unsettling account of Ham and Noah in Genesis chapter 9, verses 20 through 27. For centuries, this passage has been invoked to justify everything from racial hierarchies to slavery, often under the claim that Ham committed some undefined sexual sin and that his descendants were therefore divinely cursed. These interpretations have not only strained the text, they have damaged real people. But today, I want to step back and ask a simpler but far more important question. What does the text itself actually emphasize, and how would an ancient Israelite audience, shaped by honor, family loyalty, and social boundaries, have understood what happened inside Noah's tent? This reading follows a growing body of scholarship that argues the episode is best understood through the lens of familial honor and shame, not sexual transgression. Now, that does not make the passage more morally lightened. It means that the nature of the offense must be read according to the world of the Bible, not projected backward from later moral debates. So, by walking carefully through the narrative alongside respected Old Testament scholars and ancient Near Eastern background material, I will endeavor to demonstrate that the central issue in this text is not erotic violation, but public dishonor, betrayal of filial duty, and the rupture of the household order. And that shift in the reading, I should say, changes everything about how this text should be taught, preached, and applied. Genesis 9:20 through 27 forms a tightly organized narrative unit. Noah plants a vineyard. He drinks wine, becomes drunk, and lies uncovered inside his tent. Ham, the father of Canaan, sees his father's nakedness and tells his two brothers outside. Now Shem and Japheth respond by walking backward with a garment and carefully covering their father without looking upon him. When Noah wakes and learns what his youngest son had done to him, he pronounces a curse not on Ham directly, but on Ham's son Canaan. Two things should immediately arrest our attention in this text. The first thing is that the narrative moves very economically. Moses is very reticent as he provides no elaboration, no moral commentary, and no explicit description of any physical act beyond seeing and telling. The spotlight of the story is not on what Noah does in his drunkenness, but on how the sons respond to his vulnerability. The second thing that arrests our attention is the contrast between Ham and his brothers. Now, this is the literary heart of the passage. Ham sees and speaks. Shem and Japheth refuse to see and silently act. The ethical weight of the story falls on two opposite responses to the same shameful situation. This framing already suggests that the text is oriented toward honor behavior, not sexual misconduct. The narrative never uses any of the Hebrew euphemisms that elsewhere clearly mark sexual acts. Instead, it repeatedly reinforces the issue of seeing, covering, and exposure. To understand this passage better, we must enter the moral world of the ancient Israelites and their Near Eastern neighbors. Because in that world, family was the primary social institution, and the patriarch embodied the honor and legal standing of the entire household. So to shame the father was to threaten the stability of the family itself. Now, Victor Matthews and Don Benjamin show that the household in ancient Israel functioned as both an economic and legal unit. The father was not merely a private individual in this instance. He represented the family publicly. His disgrace was not simply personal. It carried social consequences for all under his authority. Let's consider ancient Near Eastern literature to reinforce this perspective. When we consider the Akkad epic, which was preserved in Ugaritic literature, the ideal son is praised as the one who supports his father when he is drunk and carries him when he is overcome with wine. The son's duty is not moral perfection in the father. The son's duty is protection in the father's weakness. That is precisely the moral landscape in which Genesis 9 operates. Noah's drunkenness is not endorsed in this text. But the narrative assumes that a son's responsibility in such a moment is not exposure, but protection of the father. Ham violates that expectation. It is not simply that he sees the father naked. The narrative emphasizes that he then goes out and broadcasts his father's shame to others. The publicizing of the vulnerability is what transforms a private failure into communal disgrace. Now, Shem and Japheth, by contrast, embody the expected filial response. They avert their eyes, they move in unity, they restore what Ham exposed. Their actions recover the father, and with him, the fractured dignity of the household. Gordon Wenham notes that many interpreters, especially us in Western contexts, have felt compelled to search for a more sensational offense behind Ham's behavior because we struggle to believe that simply seeing could trigger such a severe curse. But Wenham argues that this impulse reflects a cultural blind spot on our parts. In societies where discretion and family loyalty are supreme virtues, the true offense lies precisely in the publicization of private disgrace. According to Wenham, his failure, Ham's failure, was not sexual aggression, but moral betrayal through exposure and mockery. Noah's shame was not that he was naked. His shame was that his son refused to shield him from humiliation. Klaus Westermann is even more direct. He insists that speculative sexual reconstructions miss the literary and ethical point of the passage entirely. Ham's wrongdoing consists in refusing to cover his father. The narrative does not invite us to imagine a hidden offense here. It forces us to face the moral weight of dishonor itself. Now, these scholars are not denying that the episode is serious. They are insisting that its seriousness lies in social violation, not in erotic violation. So, why have sexual interpretations been so dominant in later readings and understandings of this text? Part of the answer lies in how later biblical texts use the phrase to uncover nakedness. And they use it as a euphemism for sexual relationships, particularly in Leviticus. Some have assumed that this legal usage must control the interpretation of Genesis 9 retroactively. But that method overlooks genre, chronology, and narrative intent. Take, for instance, Leviticus. That is legal material. Genesis 9 is narrative in its genre. Legal idiom cannot simply be imported into earlier storytelling without risking distortion. Robert Alter, in his book The Art of Biblical Narrative, observes that biblical narrative knows how to be quite explicit when it intends to portray sexual transgression. The David and Bathsheba account leaves no ambiguity. The Sodom and Gomorrah narrative leaves no ambiguity. The absence of sexual language in Genesis 9 is not an accident. It is a narrative signal. Frethheim likewise situates this episode within a genealogy-driven narrative concerned with the founding of peoples and the transmission of blessing and curse. The text is functioning as a theological explanation for later historical relationships, not as a case study in sexual ethics. This does not mean that sexual interpretations are rational. What it means is that they have moved beyond what the text clearly states. The burden of proof must always rest on the reader who proposes details the narrative itself withholds. One of the most misunderstood elements of this passage is the curse itself. Noah does not curse Ham, he curses Canaan. This is not arbitrary. It reflects the ancient understanding that dishonor carries multi-generational social consequences. In A&E jurisprudence, as documented by Martha Roth and others, actions that destabilize the household could affect inheritance, lineage status, and clan standings across generations. The concern was not only individual guilt, but communal order. Within the narrative logic of Genesis, Canaan represents a future people group that will eventually stand in conflict with Israel. The curse functions not as a biological sentence, but as a theological explanation of why later hostility exists between Israel and a particular Canaanite group. Importantly, though, the text nowhere universalizes the curse to all of Ham's descendants. Take, for instance, Cush, Egypt, and Put are not cursed. Only Canaan is. That limitation alone dismantles later racialized usages of this passage. The curse arises not from sexual impurity, but from social rupture. It is tied to dishonor, betrayal of filial responsibility, and the exposure of patriarchal shame. Now, at this point, let me explain what I am doing with this kind of reading of the passage. I am not claiming that all scholars reject sexual interpretations of this text, as the field remains divided. What I have endeavored to demonstrate for you is that a substantial and coherent stream of scholarship emphasizes honor, shame, and family boundaries as a primary framework for reading Genesis chapter 9. My argument rests on three cumulative observations. The first observation is that the narrative offers no explicit sexual language, even though biblical authors elsewhere use such language freely to indicate sexual impropriety. The second is that the ethical contrast focuses not on violation versus restraint, but on exposure versus covering. The third is that ancient Near Eastern social norms consistently portray a son's duty as protection from a fallen or protection of a fallen father, not inspection, not mockery, or rumor spreading. From these converging lines of evidence, my conclusion follows carefully. The text is not about erotic transgression. It is about whether a son will guard or exploit his father's vulnerability. That reading honors the literary design of the passage. It respects the cultural world of the author, and it avoids forcing speculative details into a narrative that deliberately withholds them. This is not merely an academic correction on my part. I think it carries deep theological implications. The first is it confronts centuries of misuse of this text. The so-called curse of Ham was used as a theological weapon to justify slavery and racial hierarchy. But Genesis 9 does not support such applications at any level. The curse is not racial. It is not universal. It is not tied to skin color. It is tied to dishonor within a particular familial line. The second thing is this reading reframes sin in deeply relational terms. The offense in Genesis 9 is not a private vice. It is public betrayal. It is not lust. It is disloyalty. It is not the body that is ultimately violated. It is the bond between father and son and the normative social expectations that attend that kind of relationship. The third thing is that this passage exposes how righteousness in Scripture often consists not in moral distance from sinners, but in faithful protection of the fallen. Shem and Japheth do not celebrate their father's failure. They absorb his shame in order to restore his dignity. In that sense, they function as early narrative foreshadowings of the redemptive pattern that we will later see fulfilled in Jesus Christ. He is the one who bears shame in order to cover others. It is like reaching back to the covering of the nakedness of Adam and Eve in the garden and looking forward to God's people in Christ clothed in his righteousness. So let's conclude this. Genesis 9, verses 20 through 27 is not a text about hidden sexual scandal. It is a text about the fragile nature of honor, the moral weight of familial loyalty, and the devastating power of exposure. Its ethical center is found not in what Noah did in weakness, but in what his sons did in response to that weakness. Ham looked and spoke. Shem and Japheth refused to look and quietly restored. One turned vulnerability into public disgrace. The others turned disgrace back into dignity. When we read this passage through the world that produced it rather than through later ideological agendas, its meaning becomes both clearer and more challenging. It calls readers, ancient and modern, to a costly form of faithfulness that shields rather than shames, protects rather than exploits, and restores rather than exposes. And I think that is why this ancient story still unsettles us. It asks us not merely how we judge sin, but how we respond to the sinner. Do we broadcast their failure, or do we cover in love? God bless you, and thank you for watching Explorations in Biblical Studies. Leave a like, a comment, and please share this video. Let me know in the comments which topic you'd like me to address next. Till next time, keep your eyes fixed on Jesus Christ. God bless you.